Welcome to the Social Justice War Room, the podcast where we discuss social justice in fiction, reality, and everything in between. My next guest today is a member of the webcomic community. He's done a tremendous amount of work. She's the creator of the Care Bear Comics universe, an elaborate superhero universe with multiple characters and artists. Her main series is Almighty Protectors on Comic Fury. Please welcome Ave Messer. How are you doing, Ave?
I'm doing okay, pretty decently at least.
Yeah, so you've been doing comics for a long time now, and there's like at least 10 years worth of work on your Comic Fury archive. What got you into it?
Well, it was ultimately as a fan of superheroes. I always know they work best in comics. The stories I always wanted to tell, comics. I just never was an artist. As one can attest, if they read some of my earlier stuff, Care Bear Comics Unlimited, it was pretty bad to start with. It's not exactly amazing now, but it's as good as I can do with my art. That's why I get other people's when I can.
Well, everyone has to start somewhere. I started basically teaching myself how to draw while I was doing my own comics, so I can relate to that. And I mean, as long as you're telling the story, it's fine. But you mentioned you've had other artists before. How do you go about setting up those collaborations?
I've found that actually the best place to just do it is like go on to a place like Fiverr and find the ones that'll work for the rates that you can go for, and go from there. And I've also found that often people will figure out their worth is higher than what you can afford. And what you do then is you wish them well and be grateful that they realize that they are actually worth more than they were charging.
Yeah, well, if they're offering to work for lower, then that's consenting. Yeah,
It is
so
consenting, but it's also, I've found that people are too detrimental of their own skills often, and so they lower them. They lower their feeling of their own value because they're too detrimental of themselves.
yeah, but that does give them the chance to get work out and get important practice. And you have had a lot of good artists on your work. So
Yeah, a lot of good artists, and also me. So not all good art.
yeah, so your work deals with themes that aren't often addressed in superhero comics, specifically a lot of LGBT themes. Has Do you think that caught up in mainstream comics in recent years, or is it still largely something left either unexamined or poorly examined?
Uh, it's something that still hasn't truly caught up, especially because, well, for one thing, you can just see from how much there's so much fan backlash whenever there's anything that is slightly not cis white male. Cis hetero white male, that they're just like, people go crazy online, and it's just like, come on, the people are people. Come on with
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's come up a lot on this podcast. And on the one hand, it's easy to just write off the people as a complaining as a vocal minority, but they do a lot of damage with how much noise and threat they raise and threats they make.
Yeah, and the problem is there are some actually established creators in the industry who also uh, are sympathetic to that point of view. Very specifically, I can think of one particular artist who kind of spearheaded the Comicsgate movement.
It's the frog guy.
Yeah, Cyberfrog. Which the thing is, Cyberfrog is not a comic that I consider to be bad. I just don't like the freaking guy that made it.
I haven't read it, and the new version, since puts it behind those expensive Indiegogo paywalls, I don't see why
Uh,
anyone would want to read it unless they just wanted to own the libs so badly they'd burn that much money, especially since
yeah,
he's so poor at actually fulfilling his campaigns.
yeah, he's somebody that it's like his art's good, and I wish that he were a better person, because it's like I would support him if he were a better person.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be that hard for him to be a better person, and he still hasn't done it. And I still can't fathom why he did what he did, because he basically was an A-list artist at DC and he torched his career for this culture war crap, and he's caused a lot of damage. And maybe I'm just waiting for when like the money he gets from the his hate campaigns dries up. And but yeah, but also there's the fact that the mainstream companies are far from saintly, including especially when it comes to LGBT issues. Like even a lot of the stuff that you see with see now with more inclusive characters, it's usually done in such a way that they can just go back to the old stuff the second it stops being as it as much of a thing.
Yeah, it's just one of those. I can only imagine if we would have had the internet back in the 40s, people would have been going all crazy when there were characters like, say, Black Fury and stuff, who were just, she was a prominent female character in comics, and it's like, oh, how dare they?
Right. Yeah. Or especially in the 60s and the 70s. But also that brings me to your work, because you have used a lot of public domain characters and brought them into settings where they're modernized. Do you have a particular affection for that kind of golden age character, or is it the fact that it's a blank slate, since those comics were very simplistic because they were very early in the medium?
Well, I do kind of like the idea of taking these characters as they were back then and seeing what you can do of bringing them into a more modern sort of sensibility of a story, having them actually look at issues that those comics would have never had them look at. But also, there's just a simple fact that some of the characters are just fun, even if they're objectively poorly done characters. It's like, but what if you go in there and actually make something fun out of what's pretty bad?
Yeah.
I've never used Red B, but he's one that I'm like, how could you do that in a proper way?
Well, a lot of times it seemed like not sure which comics historian said it, that was like the same superhero showed up every month with a new name and a new color for his costume.
There are a lot of them like that.
Are there any that but you mentioned the Red Bee as someone you think would be particularly fun to like redo. Are there any others who have like something there that was ahead of its time you that could be gone back to?
Well, I've always had an affinity for, say, Madame Fatal, because she's one that I there's something that you can work with that, by the fact of a cross-dressing superhero, which that must have been quite scandalous back in the day. I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't 22 issues, but just like that's a character that you can go into and actually kind of explore a little bit more with, because you've already got something there that in the 40s must have been, they're like, don't talk about that.
Yeah. When you look back at stuff from that era and how it handles issues of gender identity and sexuality, like how, how do you how does one judge that because obviously no, there's far less understanding. I mean that there's never excuse for outright bigotry, but a lot of it just seems like they don't have the vocabulary to discuss things.
Well, yeah, there's just also the fact that you can kind of show how if you put up modern characters into their setting, like what happened in Almighty Protectors when I had my characters go back, well, go into the world of the public domain superheroes. They had their sensibilities, and it was them rubbing up against the just institutional ignorance that was just there, like the fact that they met the the Captain Marvel, the public domain version of Captain Marvel, and he's meaning well, but he is saying some not okay things because it's the
Yeah.
1940s, and that's what people said.
Yeah, but it's interesting because your characters are like entirely part of that so-called alphabet mafia. Not to be flip about it, but that's the term for LGBTQ and the various things that are added, which so that definitely creates tension when coming up against characters like that, no matter which side they're on.
Yeah, I mean, I have a tendency to make my characters tend to be part of the LGBT community, in part because I'm part of it, but also just, I mean, well, that's a main thing about it, because I'm writing characters that I want to read myself. It's like, for the most part, I'm not really wanting to read straight characters, straight cis characters.
There's already a surplus of those.
Yeah. Straight cis heterosexual. Oh well, cis het white characters are the default in Marvel and DC,
Yeah,
and
that's true.
I don't tend to go that way. Uh, I know that there was one time where there was a comic that I created that was all off characters from the public domain, and so most of them were cis het straight people, and I didn't find it very interesting. I couldn't continue with it.
Yeah, which is why a lot of why your material tends to go in a different direction than that, because that direction is so well trodden, right?
Yeah, at least I found it more interesting than the comic where I had myself as a superhero. That was so boring because I'm boring.
I thought it was a nice gesture. I thought it was interesting to do a kind of autobiographical superhero story, because
It was
it
basically a what if I got superpowers? And it's just like, do I really think I'd have any adventures? Do I really
that's
think people would care about me? I'd
that's
rather put
fair.
elements of myself into characters and put all of myself into a character.
Yeah, that's true. But it was a nice experiment, right?
It was a nice experiment. I'm not going to go back to it. Heck, uh, if one has read all the way through my comic up to through the stuff I did last year, they'll know I totally intend to not go back to myself as a superhero. I made sure of it.
Ah, right. Yeah. But you do have all this as part of the Care Bear comics universe. Is that the name you go with for
Yeah,
your
Care Bear Comics is the name I go with for the stuff, in part because while I go by my middle name, Kara is my first name. And so it's just like Care Bear, even though I
nice.
kind of think it's a silly name. But I thought it was good at the start, and it's like, well, I'll keep branding stuff that way.
And the advantage of having your own superhero universe is that you can use and reuse anything you've created in that universe, right?
Yeah, I did ultimately begin it with the idea of, with the really bad idea that, oh yeah, I'll just continue, I'll just make a line of comics. I'll find a way to make it just be like its own big universe with all these different things. It's like, I can't manage that. I I'll do one comic, Almighty Protectors, and the other ones are basically supplemental to that now.
Well, it's a good idea to have like a flagship and then have stuff around that. Usually, like Marvel and DC do that with the Avengers and Justice League, respectively. So
Yeah, and I know back in the '90s, their big flagship title was really X-Men, and that's what I grew up with. Um, and it's funny to me though that I tend to think of I grew up with X-Men. They were the team, and yet I tend to relate my comic more to the Fantastic Four than I do the X-Men.
what do you mean by that?
Maybe in part because they go on all these wild adventures to different places, which is a very Fantastic Four thing, and they're very much more of a family.
Yeah, I've seen right. I've seen that dynamic, the found family.
Yeah, the found family. I mean, you do have two groups of siblings. Two pairs of siblings in there, but
Yeah.
it's the way it works. That they have varying relationships with their parents, different ways they relate with their parents. I mean, one was completely kicked out of her home. Another one, the twins, their parents are, well, one of them's okay with it. The other one's and then the other two, they actually have pretty okay parents about it.
Yeah, that I guess that of course mirrors the way real life reactions to coming out go.
Yeah. I think it in part comes from the fact that my family has very mixed reactions to after I came out. And so I'm like, yeah, I know that it's not just going to be horrible parents or amazing parents. And sometimes there's even nuance within the accepting or not.
Yeah.
Like the fact that my family loves me. Every bit of my family wants me in their lives. But some of them are just not as accepting.
That's unfortunate. I'm sorry, but it does sound like there's at least the desire to have you in their lives.
Oh, for sure. Even my very, very Republican dad still wants me in his life and tries. He tries.
That's good.
He tries to be okay with things, but he's kind of pretty far away from me politically.
That's good, because given how far the right has gone in an absolutely inhumane direction, if he can at least show you some acceptance.
I mean, maybe part of it helps that I came out back when I was in college, back in the I'd like to think I came out to him in maybe 2008. And so things weren't as bad in that regard back then. I mean, Bush was president, so things were not great, but they weren't as bad.
Yeah, there's definitely, in terms of like social conservatism, a vast difference between Bush and Trump.
Yeah, at the time, I thought Bush was the worst president that there could ever be. I did not want the universe to prove me wrong.
And it did, unfortunately. I mean,
Yeah.
Bush was, of course, terrible, and he did a lot of horrible things, and we're still living with those horrible things, but there wasn't the same kind of like cultural shift towards rejecting all of reality in favor of like an agenda that's just resentment and a need for revenge against whoever slighted you.
Yeah. Bush at least understood the basics of politics.
He passed the squint test for presidency. Yeah. So, but going back to less terrible topic. You've been on Comic Fury for a long time now, and you've done a lot of collaborative work, not just in terms of getting artists, but in terms of opening up your comic to guest stars and having people contribute. Like I offered an image of KA from the Wirecats for a multiversal superhero scene. How
Yeah, I'm a big fan of crossovers.
what's the best, what are some of the better crossovers that you've done with that, like where you've opened it up and people have really contributed?
Well, that's a good question. Considering I wrote most of the stuff, I don't want to be like, oh, this was great because I did it. Only one of the all of last year was just every month was a different crossover. Only one of those comics was not written by me, and I think that one was a pretty good job. It was a crossover with the comic Drunk Tank, and it was a good comic. I don't think that I was quite so good with the art on it, but then again, I'm always critical of my art, so you never know. The guy who wrote it liked it,
It's
but it was
good.
also odd to have an issue that I didn't write.
Well, is there some fulfillment to simply the process of having a community of like active participation and to like exchange things in these exercises? I guess you've done some of the holiday exchanges that they do.
Yeah, it's fun to see how people interpret your character, to see your the idea of your character running up against somebody else who, yeah, other characters that you didn't create, so their personalities are going to be a bit different. I still like the script I did for the girl power crossover, even though I think my art really brought that one down. Again, that just make just be just that being detrimental towards my art the entire way through, but I just different stuff like that. I know my first crossover in Almighty Protectors was with Misfits of Mischief, and that one I think was the most teething pains with it, because I think I was still trying to figure out how my characters cross over with others, how they interact as characters with others.
Well, it seems by now you've figured a lot of that out, since your characters do frequently go into different multiverses, and the protectors are kind of used to just kind of drifting around different parts of the universe and different genres.
Yeah, and I love the fact that I can just put them anywhere and it works with the comic. My problem currently is I'm like, I have supporting characters that I set up that I haven't really used because my characters keep going off into other universes.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of a strength of the superhero genre, though, that you can do literally anything, and it's like all the genres at once.
Yeah, that's something that I actually think a lot of people seem to not acknowledge, is the fact that superhero as a genre is really just a hodgepodge genre. It's everything. It's fantasy, it's sci-fi, it's mystery, it's just anything you can think of as far as a genre can be superhero.
It's true. That's true. And though when it comes to shared universes, they don't all use that potential. Or like you could definitely see there's a tone set for, say, the MCU, and they seem to have broadened it a bit now that they lost their biggest actors. Something, but that's something that the comics will never have to deal with because their characters are comic characters and thus immortal.
I do really appreciate where the MCU is going on the idea of multiple universes, but one of its problems is it started out very political, and it's backed away from that so much. You watch the first Iron Man film, and it is so political.
Right.
It wasn't afraid to talk about things. Maybe what maybe they weren't doing everything perfectly, but they were trying. And they that I think that's what threw everybody for a loop with Black Panther, was because Black Panther, what kind of felt like they were trying to go back to that sort of thing.
Yeah,
But
that's a
people
good
are now
point.
used to the MCU films being all safe.
Well, it seems like when they were setting up with Iron Man, they wanted to show that it was like in how the comics had advertised themselves, the world outside your window. So they had Tony Stark in Afghanistan and dealing with terrorists. Not, I mean, they're still off-brand terrorists, which is probably for the best because they really wouldn't want to see them using real Muslims as baddies. But and then as it got more successful and they brought more things in, it just kind of meshed together to kind of a safer, more replicable tone, so that
Yeah,
they could.
but well, the thing is, they go from what feels like they could have been real terrorists in Iron Man 1. But then by the time of Iron Man 3, they're like, oh, let's do this very disjointed concept. I'm actually not a fan of that film.
I thought I was the only one because I appreciate what I was going for, but it's like you have the Mandarin raise all these points about the terribleness of the American Empire, points that are good. And it's not even that he's the bad guy making them, but that it doesn't even matter because it's just a smokescreen for the real villain, who's far less interesting than a Ben Kingsley Mandarin would have been.
And the thing is, I think Mandarin would have been better as a character if he would have been more like, heck, even more like a Killmonger. You know, somebody who has a salient point to and that actually makes you stop and think. Um,
Yeah, that's true. Like, I mean, I've complained about how Killmonger is kind of it, it's his points are done a disservice when they're coming out of someone that's obviously meant to be the bad guy, but still, like, he's a memorable character. He's a complex character. It's a superb performance by Michael B. Jordan. And like, if you had bad guys based on real world terrible people like Trump, they wouldn't be entertaining. They're too one dimensional for fiction. God,
oh
that's
yeah, I
horrifying
said
to
when
say.
Trump was back when Trump was running back in 2016, it's just he sounded like a cartoon supervillain, something that most people would say that's too unrealistic. He's too evil. Just like,
Yeah,
how can you do a caricature of what's going on now when everything's a caricature?
that's a good question that I ask myself a lot because when you're in kind of a post satire world where reality is so absurd.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
that
yeah,
that I think another problem with those Iron Man films. So even though they started out trying to say something political and everything, and I admire them trying to go with that, but their big problem is it's about the good corporate people versus the bad corporate people. When in the real world, good corporate is not really true. There's moderately okay sometimes corporate and bad corporate.
right. There's there's an issue of like structural that morality where simply having that much power and money consolidated in the hands of so few people is just going bound for abuse, even if sometimes they don't abuse it as much, or even if they sometimes do good things with it. And thinking like Disney itself, like for all people say that they are focusing on the woke agenda, they've donated a lot of money to very homophobic and transphobic politicians.
Yeah, those recent revelations that came out with them funding the everybody. that sponsor the Don't Say Gay bill. Disney sponsored freaking every one of those politicians, apparently.
Yeah.
Just like, uh, that's scary. And Disney saying, well, our most the way we can make the most difference is make inspiring content. No, the way you make the most difference is where your money goes.
Yeah. Besides, they don't treat their inspiring content for LGBTQ issues very well, like the difficulties faced by the Owl House, the fact that they always have like some kind of plausible deniability for gay characters in the Marvel universe, so they can release it in more homophobic markets.
Yeah, I would like to see more stuff that just it doesn't even give a crap about selling into China, like say the Deadpool stuff, which I realize Deadpool would have never sold in China because it was an R-rated movie, but they need to take a stand more. I also like the fact in Deadpool 2, they're like, yeah, screw it. Let's actually have characters that are more front and center LGBT. Let's have Deadpool openly flirt with Colossus. I like that fact, even though that movie was had still some problematic elements to it, like fridging a female character just to give the male character more motivation and stuff.
Right.
But
Yeah. Well, even with those elements, those movies still feel like there's a very clear individual identity going on. And I guess since it was at that point when Fox was trying to grab hold of whatever remnants of Marvel IP they could, they ended up doing some more interesting things like that in Logan.
I still haven't seen Logan. I know I've heard it's a good one, but I really should see it at some point.
I
The
actually
problem
haven't either. I
is,
just from what I've heard from everyone who has.
it would be hard to find on DVD, and I'm not going to pay for a Disney Plus subscription. I don't go for streaming services because that's money, and I don't have it.
Yeah,
So,
it's
and also it's Disney Plus. I don't want to support the company that's taking over the world,
yeah, right. They're
especially not now.
especially not now. So going forward with Almighty Protectors and other Care Bear comics, what can we look forward to in the coming issues?
Well, I know I did in my most recent issue of Protectors. I revealed a big, big secret that was well, it was more of a reveal to the audience and the characters who was the villain that was posing as a hero on the team, and from there I know I've got another mystery set up that I'm going to be trying to
Cool.
solve, and so I'm working towards that. But ultimately, it's just going to be a lot of trying to tell nifty stories, trying to do still more crossovers. I even have an idea for a shared multiverse crossover that
Cool.
nobody seems to have too much interest in, but I want to get done,
Well,
and you never know if it'll happen.
it brings a smile to my face when I read your comics, and I always enjoy like being able to drop in and out and see familiar characters and watch their bantering. So thank you for that. And I look forward
Well,
to what you have coming.
you're welcome.
So thank you, Ave, for being on my podcast, and check out her work in the notes below. Have a good evening, everybody.